The distress signal was not a cry for help, but an interstellar personal ad broadcast on a frequency reserved for dying stars. And Elias Vance, sitting in a freighter held together by salvaged titanium and terrible decisions, decided to answer it. Elias rubbed his tired eyes, staring at the console of his ship. The HUD reflected a depressing string of red numbers, his outstanding debts to the Jovian mining cartels. Once, he had been a top-tier negotiator for the United Earth Directorate, brokering peace treaties in boardrooms that smelled of expensive leather and polished mahogany. Now, he hauled refined helium across the desolate, freezing edges of the solar system, dodging repo ships and subsisting on reconstituted protein paste. He was 38, spectacularly cynical, and entirely out of options. The anomalous signal cut through the background radiation of deep space like a razor. It was wrapped in an encryption algorithm so dense it made Earth's military-grade security look like a child's lockbox. It took his ship's onboard intelligence 6 grueling hours to crack the cipher, nearly frying the central processor in the process. When the translated text finally scrolled across his main visor, Elias spat out his coffee. It was a formal solicitation. 2 high-ranking females of the Aethelgardian ascendancy, a sovereign power completely absent from any human database, were seeking a human male for immediate diplomatic and personal union. The message detailed the precise physiological and psychological parameters required. It was incredibly blunt, bypassing all diplomatic pleasantries to offer a lifetime of unimaginable wealth, advanced technological patronage, and sanctuary, all in exchange for a binding, multifaceted partnership. Elias leaned back in his worn pilot's chair. This was either an elaborate trap set by the cartel bounty hunters or the most absurd opportunity in the history of the cosmos. He glanced at the red ledger glowing on his secondary monitor. The cartel would shatter his kneecaps by Tuesday. The mysterious alien envoys might dissect him, but at least it would be a novel experience. Driven by a volatile cocktail of crushing debt, terminal boredom, and a reckless sense of humor, he calibrated his comms array. He typed out his exact coordinates, appended a brief message stating he was available, highly motivated, and currently orbiting Neptune, and slammed the transmit key. He expected silence. He did not expect the fabric of space outside his cockpit to fold inward. A colossal structure materialized from the void, shedding a stealth field that rippled like oil on water. It was a dreadnought, sleek and obsidian, dwarfing his freighter to the size of a gnat. There was no aggressive maneuver, no warning shot. A localized manipulation of gravity simply seized his ship, gently but immovably pulling it into a cavernous, brilliantly illuminated hangar bay. Elias unholstered his sidearm, checked the power cell, and immediately holstered it again. If they could manipulate gravity like a tow rope, a plasma pistol was an insult. He popped the airlock seal and stepped out onto a deck polished to a mirror shine. The atmosphere was breathable, carrying a faint, intoxicating scent of ozone and crushed silver leaf. A contingent of guards flanked the hangar, clad in seamless pearl-white armor. They parted in perfect unison as 2 figures approached. Elias felt the breath catch in his throat. They were undeniably humanoid, but possessed an ethereal, aggressive elegance that made the most beautiful humans look unrefined. The taller of the 2, Lyra, moved with the predatory grace of a sovereign. Her hair was a startling luminescent silver, braided tightly against a high-collared, deep indigo uniform that indicated immense authority. Her eyes were chips of pale ice, analytical and entirely uncompromising. Beside her walked Kaelin. She shared the same statuesque height and flawless bone structure, but her presence was warmer, her hair a cascading midnight blue, and her eyes held a spark of intense, unabashed curiosity. Lyra stopped 3 paces away. She evaluated him with a gaze that felt like a physical scan. She stated that he was smaller than the statistical average for an Earthguardian, noting his elevated cortisol levels and the rudimentary nature of his vessel. Elias offered a wry smile, crossing his arms. He replied that it was a long drive, the traffic was terrible, and he left his formal tuxedo in his other spaceship. Kaelin released a short, melodious laugh, a sound that echoed pleasantly in the vast hangar. She stepped forward, her posture relaxed. She told Lyra that the human possessed the defensive wit their psychological profiles predicted, suggesting it was a sign of intellectual resilience. Elias was escorted from the hangar into the belly of the ship. The architecture defied human physics, featuring corridors of flowing organic curves and chambers illuminated by ambient, sourceless light. They arrived at a sprawling observation deck overlooking the distant, blue sphere of Neptune. A low table materialized from the floor, bearing chalices of a clear, glowing liquid. They sat, and the reality of the situation rapidly descended upon Elias. Lyra took the lead, her voice a cool, authoritative command. She explained the Aethelgardian ascendancy. They were a matriarchal society, governed by strict logic, supreme order, and a caste system based on intellectual and genetic merit. They had observed Earth for centuries, watching humanity stumble through world wars, climate collapses, and its clumsy first steps into the stars. Now, the greater galactic community was drafting a monumental treaty, a coalition of star systems banding together against an encroaching, unnamed threat from the galactic rim. Earth, positioned strategically at a crucial hyperspace crossroads, was slated for forced annexation. The Council viewed humanity as a volatile, primitive species, too violent to be trusted with autonomy, but too geographically important to ignore. Kaelin leaned forward, her dark eyes locking onto his. She explained that their faction within the Ascendancy believed humanity had potential. They believed Earth deserved a seat at the table, not a yoke around its neck. But to prove human viability to the cynical Galactic Council, they required a profound demonstration of integration, a union. Lyra's gaze was piercing. She clarified that it was not merely a signature on a document. It required a full, irrevocable bond, a physical, cultural, and psychological merging between Earth's representative and the high envoys of Aethelgard. They required a human capable of navigating alien political treachery, someone who understood the brutal realities of negotiation, yet possessed the genetic and emotional fortitude to withstand the absolute intensity of Aethelgardian bonding rites. Elias took a slow sip of the glowing liquid. It tasted like liquid sunlight and immediately sharpened his senses. He looked between the two formidable women. He pointed out the obvious flaw in their plan. They had picked up a washed-up, debt-ridden freight pilot. Lyra projected a holographic dossier onto the table. It was his entire life. His tenure at the UN, the impossible ceasefires he had engineered in the resource wars, the tactical brilliance he had shown before politics and corruption had forced him into exile. She stated they did not want a politician who would cower before the council. They wanted a survivor. They needed a man who could smile at a loaded gun and negotiate the price of the bullets. Elias looked at the dossier, then out at the stars. The magnitude of the offer was paralyzing. He was being asked to act as the single anchor for a species that didn't even know it was on trial, binding himself to two alien women whose technology was indistinguishable from magic. He was completely, irrevocably out of his depth. Yet, as he looked at Kaelin's hopeful, engaging smile and felt the undeniable magnetic challenge radiating from Lyra's stoic posture, the cynical shell he had built around himself began to crack. There was a raw, thrilling chemistry here, a promise of adventure that made his previous life look like a gray, suffocating box. He realized he was standing on the precipice of a new reality, one where the rules of human limitation no longer applied. He just needed to know if he would survive the initiation, and who exactly was pulling the strings in the shadows of this grand galactic treaty. Elias finished his drink, set the chalice on the table, and met Lyra's icy gaze. He told them to power up the hyperdrive because he was ready to see their world. Stepping onto a spaceship that bent the laws of physics was one thing, but realizing the universe traveled faster than a bad rumor was another entirely. The Aethelgardian dreadnought did not simply accelerate. It ripped a seam in the fabric of reality, pulled the edges back, and slipped through the cracks into a dimension of pure velocity. Elias stood on the sprawling observation deck, watching the familiar stars stretch into infinite, blinding threads of violet and gold. The quantum slipstream drive operated on principles that made his head ache. Emitting a low, sub-harmonic vibration he felt deep in his molars. The sheer scale of his isolation hit him abruptly. Earth was no longer just a distant planet. It was a memory fading in the rearview mirror of a vessel moving leagues beyond the speed of light. Yet, the paralyzing fear he expected never arrived, replaced instead by a surging, adrenaline-fueled curiosity. His transition into Aethelgardian culture, however, was significantly less graceful than the ship's navigation. 10 hours into the journey, a deeply human inconvenience arose. Elias was starving. He retreated to the quarters Lyra had assigned him. An expansive suite featuring sweeping curves and bioluminescent walls that shifted color based on his ambient body temperature. He approached the wall-mounted nutritional synthesizer, a sleek metallic alcove that Kalen promised could replicate any organic compound in the known galaxy. Desperate for a taste of home, Elias requested a simple, medium-rare steak and a dark stout. The machine hummed, scanned his biometrics with a warm optical laser, and chimed cheerfully. A panel slid open, revealing a perfectly symmetrical gelatinous gray cube in a glass of tepid, clear fluid. A holographic readout flashed a message in translated English, informing him that the ingestion of mild neurotoxins and charred, decaying mammalian tissue was mathematically counterproductive to cellular longevity and optimal brain function. The cube, the machine proudly declared, was a hyper-dense amalgam of engineered kelp proteins and synthetic vitamins. Elias stared at the offensive cube. He argued aloud with the wall interface, explaining that he was a flawed, carbon-based life form who required cholesterol and fermented grains for basic morale. The machine simply chimed again, steadfast in its dietary superiority. Kalen strolled into the room just in time to witness his utter defeat, her melodic laughter echoing off the smooth architecture. She wore a more casual version of her uniform, the rigid fabrics replaced by something that flowed like dark water. She plucked the gray cube from the tray, took a delicate bite, and declared it a culinary masterpiece of efficiency. Elias mournfully chewed his tasteless geometry, offering a sarcastic toast with his glass of hyper-oxygenated water. The humiliation continued in the cleansing bay. Instead of a standard sonic shower, Elias found himself facing a gravity fluid chamber. It was a circular room lined with silver conduits. He stripped down and pressed what he assumed was the activation plate. Instantly, the localized gravity failed. Spheres of warm, opalescent water detached from the floor grates and began floating around the room. Attempting to wash himself became a high-stakes, zero-gravity athletic event. He leaped to catch a sphere of soapy fluid, slipped on the slick decking, and accidentally hit the main override panel with his elbow. He spent the next 20 minutes trapped mid-air, floating upside down inside a massive lavender-scented bubble of hydrogel, furiously trying to paddle his way to the control console. He looked like an insect caught in amber. The doors hissed open, and Kalen stood in the threshold. She did not laugh immediately. She observed his frantic swimming motions with intense, scientific fascination before a wide grin broke across her flawless face. With a graceful tap on the external keypad, she restored the gravity. Elias dropped to the floor with a heavy splash, dripping wet and profoundly unamused, while Kaelin handed him a thermal drying cloth, her eyes dancing with wicked delight. Despite the indignities of alien plumbing and dictatorial food synthesizers, Elias found himself utterly captivated by his hosts. The dichotomy between the two sisters was a puzzle he eagerly tried to solve. Lyra was the architect of their mission, a woman built of unyielding stoicism and calculated precision. She treated him like an incredibly valuable, volatile antique. She monitored his biological readouts from afar, her pale eyes always assessing his physical and mental state. She was fiercely protective, an apex predator guarding her territory, ensuring his cortisol levels remained within acceptable parameters. Her interactions with him were sharp, efficient, and entirely devoid of small talk. Kaelin, conversely, was all warmth and sharp-witted curiosity. She spent hours in his quarters, peppering him with questions about Earth. She wanted to know about human fiction, the concept of a weekend, and the illogical nature of terrestrial sports. Through Kaelin, Elias began to understand the sterile, utopian existence of the Aethelgardians. They had engineered suffering, poverty, and disease out of their society millennia ago. In doing so, they had also accidentally engineered out unpredictability and raw passion. During the fourth cycle of their quantum transit, the three of them sat in a dimly lit recreation lounge overlooking the swirling vortex of the slipstream. The ambient lighting shifted to mimic a warm, terrestrial sunset, casting long, golden shadows across the sleek seating arrangements. Elias decided to show them the unvarnished truth of his species. He bypassed the sanitized, diplomatic histories he used to recite at the UN. He told them about the messy, chaotic reality of humanity. He spoke of the Renaissance born from the ashes of a plague, of grand, weeping symphonies composed by starving, heartbroken artists, and of brutal resource wars fought over lines drawn in the sand. He recounted a specific negotiation he had brokered in a burning city on Earth, sitting across a table from a warlord while artillery shells shook the dust from the ceiling. He explained that humanity was a species defined not by its pursuit of perfection, but by its spectacular, chaotic ability to break, heal, and rebuild. Their history was a tapestry of terrible mistakes and breathtaking triumphs. Lyra listened in absolute silence. For the first time, the icy barrier she maintained seemed to thaw marginally. Her analytical mind processed the profound contradictions of human nature. She recognized the terrifying strategic brilliance required for Earth's survival. And more importantly, she recognized the quiet, unbreakable strength in the man sitting before her. He was not a fragile primitive to be shielded, nor a simple political pawn to be played on the galactic board. He was a survivor who carried the crushing weight of his world with a cynical smile and a steady hand. She reached across the low table, her long, elegant fingers lightly tracing the faded shrapnel scar on Elias's forearm. The touch was initially clinical, a brief physical assessment, but it lingered a fraction of a second too long. The temperature in the room seemed to spike. Kaelin moved closer to him on the curved seating arrangement, her shoulder brushing against his arm. The physical contact sent a jolt of static electricity straight to his chest. The air grew heavy, suddenly thick with an undeniable magnetic tension. The structured, emotionless existence of Aethelgard lacked this raw gravity. The sisters were realizing this proposed union was not merely a genetic and political transaction. It was binding them to a fire they had never felt. Elias looked at Kaelin's dark, expressive eyes, then met Lyra's intense, softening gaze. The boundary between a desperate diplomatic arrangement and a profound, intensely personal connection was rapidly blurring. He felt a fierce, protective instinct rising within him. an absolute certainty that he would burn the galaxy down before letting either of them come to harm. Yet, as the dreadnought hurtled closer to their home world, a cold knot formed in his stomach. He wondered what specific brutal trials actually awaited him in the capital, and why Lyra's jaw clenched imperceptibly every time the rites of resonance were mentioned. There was a dangerous variable in this political equation. A shadow player on the High Council violently opposed to this union, and Elias knew his survival depended on identifying them before the trap snapped shut. The Aethelgardian capital did not merely exist on the surface of its planet. It conquered the sky in a breathtaking defiance of gravity. Elias stepped off the dreadnought and immediately forgot how to breathe. Before him stretched a metropolis of floating spires, colossal structures of woven pearl and iridescent metal that drifted gently among clouds of violet gas. They were tethered not by steel, but by shimmering columns of hard light. Below, the ground was a lush ocean of bioluminescent flora, radiating soft blues and vivid magentas that pulsed in rhythm with the planet's magnetic field. It was a world entirely free of dirt, decay, and the grinding rust that defined Earth. It was also, Elias realized as a phalanx of silent guards surrounded them, a beautifully gilded cage. Lyra and Kaelin escorted him through a soaring archway into the grand sanctum of the High Council. Elias tugged uncomfortably at the high collar of his formal diplomatic tunic, a seamless garment of spun silver that felt remarkably like a straitjacket. He was acutely aware of the stairs. Thousands of Aethelgardian elites, draped in flowing geometric silks, lined the terraced balconies of the hall, their pale eyes fixed on the alien walking among their highest envoys. At the apex of the chamber stood the governing dais, and at its center sat Chancellor Vorek. Vorek was a striking figure even by Aethelgardian standards, his features so sharply angled they looked carved from diamond. He wore robes of deep crimson, a stark contrast to the tranquil blues and silvers of the court. As Elias approached, Vorek's gaze bore into him, radiating an icy, unadulterated disdain. The Chancellor was a political purist of the highest order. He viewed the proposed alliance with Earth as an ideological contamination, firmly believing that humanity was a volatile plague of primitive apes best kept on a short, electrified leash. The evening's welcome banquet was less a celebration and more an exquisitely orchestrated interrogation. They were seated at a crystalline table that hovered an inch above the floor. The air was thick with the scent of synthetic nectar and the quiet, dangerous hum of political maneuvering. Vorek did not waste time with pleasantries. Halfway through a course of floating, gelatinous spheres that tasted vaguely of starlight, the Chancellor stood silencing the massive hall with a single raised hand. Vorek's voice was a resonant baritone that amplified perfectly across the acoustics of the chamber. He welcomed the envoys home, praising their safe return, before turning his piercing attention to Elias. With a predatory smile, Vorek began to dismantle human history for the entertainment of the court. He spoke of Earth's ceaseless global conflicts, projecting holographic data streams above the table that displayed humanity's most brutal centuries. He listed the environmental collapses, the nuclear near misses, and the staggering inequality that defined the terrestrial socio-economic structure. Vorek painted a picture of a species that was chronically self-destructive, entirely governed by base impulses and irrational violence. He concluded his grandstanding speech by questioning the High Council's wisdom, asking the assembled elites how they could possibly tether their pristine, enlightened civilization to a man whose genetic lineage was little more than highly organized savagery. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the banquet. Kaelin tensed, her hand dropping to the edge of the table, while Lyra's jaw clenched tightly, her eyes narrowing at the Chancellor's blatant breach of diplomatic protocol. Elias did not flinch. He did not rise to the bait, nor did he allow the flush of anger to reach his face. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, casually picked up his crystal goblet, and offered Vorek a relaxed, disarming smile. Elias stood up slowly, adjusting his silver tunic. He projected his voice with the practiced, steady cadence of a man who had spent his life talking heavily armed despots off ledges. He began by thanking the Chancellor for the rigorous historical review, noting dryly that Vorek had managed to summarize 5,000 years of human failure with remarkable efficiency. A faint ripple of surprised amusement swept through the outer balconies. Elias then acknowledged the holograms still flickering above them. He did not deny the bloodshed or the chaos. He owned it completely. However, Elias shifted the narrative. He explained that a society born in utopia, shielded from disease and devoid of struggle, possessed a fatal vulnerability. They knew how to exist in peace, but they had absolutely no idea how to survive the dark. He detailed how humanity's chaotic evolution had forged a species capable of unparalleled adaptability. They had learned to weaponize hope in the face of absolute despair. They built civilizations on the ashes of their own mistakes. Elias walked to the edge of the dais, looking directly at the High Council. He stated that the impending galactic threat would not be defeated by perfect logic or sterile debate. It would require the messy, relentless, stubborn will to survive that humanity had perfected over millennia. He looked back at Vorek and delivered the final blow with devastating politeness, suggesting that while the Aethelgardians were the brilliant architects of a perfect universe, they desperately needed a human to show them how to defend it when the walls started falling down. The silence that followed was entirely different. It was the crackling, electric quiet of a paradigm shift. Suddenly, an elder counselor in the front row tapped her hand against the crystal table, a gesture of profound, traditional respect. Another joined her. Within seconds, a wave of rhythmic tapping echoed throughout the grand hall. Elias had not just survived Vorek's political assassination attempt, he had completely disarmed him, turning the crowd's prejudice into captivated respect. Vorek sat down, his flawless face a mask of barely contained fury. The banquet resumed with a renewed, vibrant energy, the atmospheric tension broken by the humans' audacious display of wit. Later that evening, safely secured in the private wing of the envoy's estate, the adrenaline of the confrontation began to fade. The estate was a sanctuary of quiet luxury, featuring an open balcony that overlooked the glowing canopy of the capital. Elias stood at the railing, watching the violet clouds drift past the spires. He heard the soft rustle of fabric as Lyra and Kaelin stepped out to join him. Kaelin handed him a small flask of an amber liquid, her eyes shining with genuine admiration. She confessed that she had never seen anyone, let alone an outsider, leave Chancellor Vorek completely speechless. She bumped her shoulder playfully against his, the warmth of her presence a stark contrast to the cool night air. Lyra stepped to his other side. Her usual stoic demeanor was entirely absent. She looked at him not as an assignment or a diplomatic variable, but as an equal. She spoke softly, her voice devoid of its usual clinical detachment. She thanked him. She admitted that she had feared the burden they placed upon him would break his spirit, but instead, he had shielded them both from the council's wrath. The profound vulnerability in Lyra's confession shifted the gravity on the balcony. Elias looked into her pale eyes and saw a fierce, unyielding loyalty reflecting back at him. He turned to Kaelin, seeing the deep, empathetic connection she offered without hesitation. This was no longer a transaction negotiated in the cold void of space. The lines of duty and desire had irrevocably tangled. Elias realized he was falling for both of them, drawn into a complex, breathtaking dynamic that defied every rule of his previous life. He reached out, his hands finding theirs in the dim light of the bioluminescent gardens below. Yet, as the quiet intimacy settled over them. Elias could not shake the memory of Vorek's furious diamond-hard glare. The Chancellor was not a man who accepted defeat. Vorek's public humiliation would demand a violent, absolute reprisal. Elias stared out at the floating utopia, wondering exactly how Vorek planned to weaponize the upcoming sacred trials against him, and whether human stubbornness would be enough to survive a ritual designed to break gods. The Aethelgardian concept of matrimony did not involve exchanged vows or celebratory feasts, but rather a grueling ancient gauntlet designed to test the absolute limits of biological endurance. To finalize his union with the Ascendancy, Elias Vance had to survive the rites of resonance. The ceremonial arena was located deep beneath the floating capital, carved directly into the planet's crystalline bedrock. It was a brutal, cavernous amphitheater completely devoid of the soft bioluminescence and elegant curves of the surface world. Here, the air was heavy, tasting of copper and ancient dust. Thousands of elite citizens sat in absolute, unnerving silence on the terraced stone, watching intently as Elias walked onto the sand. He wore only a simple, dark tunic, entirely stripped of all technological aids and protective gear. The rites were engineered to push elite Aethelgardian physiology to its breaking point. For a human, they were statistically lethal. The first phase tested raw survival instincts against a shifting, hostile environment. Without warning, the arena floor fractured. The hidden machinery projected a localized, hyper-dense gravity maze interwoven with searing thermal vents. An Aethelgardian would utilize their reinforced skeletal structure and instantaneous reflex arcs to sprint through the devastating pressure. Elias, possessing exactly 0 genetic enhancements, felt his ribs groan dangerously the moment the first invisible gravity wave hit him. He was forced forcefully to his hands and knees, the air driven violently from his lungs. A thermal vent erupted just inches from his face, singing his eyelashes and filling the air with the smell of scorched ozone. He quickly realized he could not outrun the maze. Instead, Elias stopped fighting the environment and started reading it. He watched the rhythmic displacement of the sand, timing the gravity spikes. Using sheer stubborn lateral thinking, he scooped up a heavy handful of dense debris and hurled it into the nearest sensor node, deliberately triggering a localized gravity collapse. The resulting shockwave launched him over the thermal barrier. He rolled hard upon landing, his shoulder flaring in bright agony, but he kept moving. He used the momentum of the traps against themselves, turning human vulnerability and unpredictable chaos into a tactical shield. He baited a kinetic pulse, diving under it at the last possible fraction of a second, using the backdraft to propel himself toward the safe zone. When he finally staggered out of the hazard labyrinth, bleeding, bruised, but entirely unbroken, a murmur of genuine, unvarnished shock rippled through the thousands of spectators. The physical punishment, however, was merely a crude prelude to the crucible of mind. In the exact center of the arena rose a monolithic spire of polished obsidian, thrumming with a low, resonant frequency that Elias felt vibrating deep within his teeth. Lyra and Kaelin descended gracefully from the ceremonial dais. Their faces were completely unreadable, masking any trace of the affection they had shared the night before. They took their positions on the opposite side of the stone. Elias placed his bloody hands flat against the cold surface. The sisters mirrored his gesture, their long fingers resting just inches from his own. The neural link engaged instantly. It was a torrential, devastating flood of consciousness. Elias felt the architecture of his mind ripped entirely open. The spire demanded absolute truth, aggressively stripping away his cynical humor, his defensive posture, and his carefully constructed diplomatic composure. He was forced to project his deepest regrets and most primal, suffocating fears directly into the shared psychic space. He could not hide anything. He flooded the connection with the grim, unfiltered reality of his past. He forced the High Envoys to walk through the burning streets of Earth during the resource wars, choking on the ash of failed peace treaties. He projected the hollow, agonizing despair of sitting at a negotiation table, realizing he could not save a doomed city, feeling the heavy, sickening weight of millions of lives crushing down on his chest. He shared the cold, silent terror of the outer solar system, the soul-crushing isolation of flying a decaying freighter, completely convinced he would die alone and unremembered in the freezing dark. Lyra and Kaelin braced heavily against the psychic onslaught. Their utopian society had eradicated trauma millennia ago, leaving them entirely unprepared for the staggering, complex weight of human guilt. They felt the searing heat of his anger and the agonizing depth of his sorrow. Yet buried beneath the massive layers of trauma, they felt something magnificent. They felt his unyielding, defiant core. They felt the fierce, irrational hope that forced him to keep breathing, keep fighting, and keep rebuilding when pure logic demanded absolute surrender. Then, the psychic bridge violently shifted into a two-way street. The immense pressure of the spire broke down the final, heavily guarded walls of the Aethelgardian envoys. The icy, impenetrable fortress of Lyra's mind dissolved. Elias felt her exhausting, solitary burden of command, the crushing pressure of flawless execution, and her secret, terrifying fear that her rigidly perfect society had entirely lost its soul. Kaelin's radiant exterior melted away to reveal a deep, painful alienation, the hidden anxiety of a woman who felt too deeply and loved too fiercely in a world that prized sterile logic above all else. In that ethereal space, stripped of politics, flesh, and pretense, the three minds intertwined completely. The desperate diplomatic arrangement transitioned rapidly into a fiercely intimate, unbreakable bond. Elias felt a profound, overwhelming surge of love for these two extraordinary women, an anchoring force that silenced the chaotic storms of his own mind. He understood them perfectly, and they understood him. He was no longer a stranger in a foreign galaxy. He had finally found his harbor. High above the arena floor, observing from a secure, tinted balcony, Chancellor Vorek watched the proceedings with cold, calculated fury. The monolithic spire below was not glowing with the erratic, failing red light of rejection. It was pulsing with a brilliant, unified golden luminescence. The advanced biometric displays hovering beside the Chancellor confirmed the mathematical impossibility. The fragile human was not simply enduring the resonance, he was mastering it, and binding the Ascendancy's highest envoys to his side in the process. Vorek gripped the railing, his jaw tight enough to crack his own teeth. The purity of the Ascendancy was seconds away from being permanently compromised by a scarred, defiant terrestrial pilot. The Chancellor realized that if the Union was finalized, the faction supporting Earth would gain insurmountable political leverage, completely derailing his own grand militant designs for the upcoming galactic treaty. Vorek signaled the commander of his elite Shadow Guard, waiting silently in the alcove behind him. If the ancient traditions could not kill Elias Vance, the Chancellor would simply have to arrange a tragic, unprecedented accident. Down on the sand. Elias withdrew his hands from the stone, gasping for air, feeling completely reborn and deeply connected to the women beside him, entirely unaware that the massive energy shields separating the arena from the royal menagerie were currently being disabled. The golden light of the resonance spire was still fading from Elias's retinas when the heavy energy shielding surrounding the arena floor shattered like fragile glass. A massive displacement of air knocked the breath from the front row of spectators, followed instantly by a guttural, bone-rattling roar that belonged to a nightmare rather than a sacred ceremony. From the shadowed archway of the royal menagerie, a massive creature surged onto the pristine sand. It was an apex predator imported from the savage rim worlds. boasting 6 muscular limbs and a jagged exoskeleton that shimmered with a natural predatory cloaking mechanism. Typically kept heavily sedated behind triple-layered force fields to provide a harmless thrill for the elite. The beast was now wide awake, evidently starved, and locking its multifaceted black eyes directly onto the 3 figures standing unarmed at the center of the arena. Lyra and Kaelin were momentarily paralyzed. They were still reeling from the profound, overwhelming vulnerability of the psychic link, their minds struggling to transition from deep emotional intimacy back to physical reality. Furthermore, in Aethelgardian society, violence was a sanitized, highly mathematical affair conducted by automated drones light years away from the capital. Face-to-face brutality was entirely alien to them. For Elias Vance, however, sudden, chaotic violence was a familiar language he had learned on the burning resource fields of Earth. Elias grabbed the high envoys by their shoulders and shoved them hard behind the sturdy base of the obsidian spire. He had no plasma sidearm, no protective armor, and absolutely no backup. He dropped into a low, predatory crouch, his eyes rapidly scanning the scattered debris field left over from the earlier gravity maze. He scooped up a heavy, meter-long shard of dense crystalline rock, testing its awkward balance in his grip. The beast charged. It covered the distance across the arena with terrifying, explosive speed, its massive claws tearing deep gouges into the sand. Elias did not attempt to block the strike, knowing the kinetic force would instantly shatter his collarbone. Instead, he relied on pure, unrefined human instinct. He sidestepped at the last possible fraction of a second, letting the creature's own horrific momentum carry it blindly forward. As the armored flank blurred past him, Elias drove the jagged crystalline shard upward with every ounce of his strength, wedging it directly into the softer, unarmored joint of its front limb. The beast thrashed wildly in pain, tearing the makeshift weapon from his hands and sending Elias tumbling hard across the abrasive sand. He rolled to his feet instantly, his breathing ragged but his focus razor-sharp. Above them, sheer panic erupted in the grand viewing terraces. Aristocrats in flowing silks trampled one another to reach the exit arches. Yet, amidst the fleeing crowd, heavily armed squads in Chancellor Vorek's signature crimson armor were fast roping down into the arena. They were not aiming their sophisticated pulse rifles at the rampaging beast to protect the royal envoys. They were aiming directly at the spire. Lyra's tactical genius snapped back into hyperfocus. She reached out, catching Elias by the tunic and pulling him back into the cover of the stone just as a volley of superheated plasma scorched the exact patch of sand where he had been standing. Her pale eyes were wide but calculating. She stated with absolute chilling certainty that this was not a tragic system failure. It was a perfectly orchestrated military coup. Vorek intended to slaughter them under the convenient guise of an arena accident, declare immediate martial law, and mobilize the Ascendancy's dreadnought fleet to annihilate Earth before the galactic treaty could be signed. They were entirely out of time, and the beast was turning its massive head back toward them, enraged by the crystal shard lodged in its leg. Kaelin scanned the perimeter of the killing floor. She spotted a massive grated drainage culvert built into the lower arena wall, a rusted relic from the ancient era before the capital city was elevated into the clouds. She pointed toward the shadows, her voice cutting clearly through the deafening noise of plasma fire. Elias did not hesitate. He grabbed Lyra and Kaelin by the hands, pulling them away from the spire. They sprinted across the open sand, using the chaotic crossfire between the panicked beast and the descending Crimson Guards as cover. A loyalist soldier dropped directly into their path, raising his rifle to fire. Elias ignored the sophisticated targeting lasers painting his chest. He launched himself forward in a brutal, unpredictable terrestrial tackle that completely bypassed the guards' automated combat algorithms. He drove the armored man backward into the stone wall, the impact knocking the soldier unconscious. Elias snatched the heavy pulse rifle from the falling guard, spun around, and fired a blinding suppression spread into the pursuing squad, forcing them to dive for cover. Kaelin dropped to her knees in front of the heavy iron grate. Stripped of her digital command codes and biometric encryption keys, she resorted to a terrifyingly practical solution. She ripped a maintenance panel off the stone wall, exposing a bundle of raw power conduits. Without flinching, she crossed the live wires with her bare hands. A shower of blue sparks rained over her ceremonial silks, but the massive iron grate groaned loudly and slid upward. Elias laid down a final, sustained barrage of plasma fire, shoving the two sisters into the dark, gaping mouth of the tunnel before diving in immediately after them. The heavy iron grate slammed shut with a resounding clang. A split second later, a localized thermal explosive detonated on the arena sand outside, melting the ancient locking mechanism into a solid mass of glowing slag and sealing them inside. They tumbled blindly down a steep, slick incline. They were plunging rapidly away from the pristine, floating utopia of the surface, descending into the suffocating, forgotten depths of the planet's foundations. The air grew instantly cold and damp, heavy with the smell of rust, decaying organic matter, and the distinct metallic tang of unregulated industry. Elias hit the bottom of the chute and rolled to absorb the impact, bringing the stolen pulse rifle up to his shoulder. He activated the small, luminescent dial on the weapon's barrel, casting a harsh, narrow beam of blue light into the darkness. They were standing in a cavernous, dripping subterranean thoroughfare. Above them, miles of solid bedrock and sophisticated gravity tethers separated them from the sky they had just commanded. Massive pipes pulsed with raw geothermal energy, casting long, menacing shadows against the wet stone walls. Lyra leaned heavily against the damp wall, her luminescent silver hair plastered to her forehead with sweat and dust. The pristine, untouchable authority of her high office was completely gone, leaving only the raw, fiercely resilient woman Elias had bonded with during the mind link. She looked at him, her chest heaving as she caught her breath, and asked exactly how long he estimated they had before Vorek's hunter-killer drones flooded the underground network to finish the assassination. Elias checked the remaining charge in the rifle's power cell. He gave them a grim, unvarnished assessment. He guessed they had perhaps one standard hour before the Chancellor locked down the entire planetary power grid and sealed the borders. If they stayed hidden, they would eventually be hunted down and executed as traitors to the Ascendancy. If Vorek successfully seized the central communications spire on the surface, he would broadcast a fabricated story of their deaths, mobilize the fleet, and Earth would be reduced to a field of radioactive glass by tomorrow morning. They needed to find a way back to the surface to broadcast the truth to the entire solar system. However, accomplishing that required navigating a lightless, perilous maze filled with the very outcasts. Criminals and exiles the perfect Aethelgardian society had swept under the rug for centuries. Kaelin stepped close to Elias, her hand resting firmly against his chest. The warmth of her touch grounded him, a stark and comforting contrast to the freezing, oppressive dark surrounding them. She looked down the endless pitch-black tunnel, a terrifying departure from the brilliant sunlit corridors she had known her entire life. She whispered softly that they were officially ghosts in their own world. Elias adjusted his grip on the heavy alien weapon, feeling the familiar cold comfort of a truly desperate situation. He managed a slow, cynical smile. He told the two highest envoys of a utopian galaxy to stay close, keep their heads down, and step exactly where he stepped. "Welcome to the gutter," he told them quietly. Now it was his turn to show them how to survive the dark. A utopian society's greatest lie is not that it achieves perfection, but exactly where it buries its mistakes. Elias Vance found Aethelgard's discarded failures breathing in the suffocating dark. The undercity was a sprawling subterranean purgatory composed of rusted colossal pipes and decaying ferro-concrete. It was illuminated only by the harsh, flickering glare of scavenged neon and the angry orange glow of geothermal vents. The air was thick with humidity and the scent of synthetic rot. For Lyra and Kaelin, the descent was a terrifying plunge into an alien hellscape right beneath their own manicured gardens. For Elias, it felt remarkably like the lower levels of a terrestrial mining colony. He was finally in his element. Elias immediately stripped the envoys of their ceremonial outer silks, burying the iridescent fabrics beneath a pile of industrial slag. He handed them heavy, grease-stained cloaks he pulled off a dormant maintenance servitor. He instructed them to stoop their shoulders, avert their eyes, and walk with the heavy, exhausted gait of the desperate. Royalty walked with purpose, he explained, but survival required anonymity. They navigated the slick, narrow catwalks, blending into a transient population of outcasts. These were the citizens who had failed Aethelgard's draconian genetic purity algorithms, or dissented against the High Council's sterile logic. Lyra walked in stunned silence, her brilliant analytical mind struggling to process the sheer volume of poverty. She watched a group of ragged children with entirely curable respiratory tremors huddling around a leaking heat vent. The pristine civilization she had sworn to protect was built upon a foundation of ruthless, institutionalized cruelty. The moral absolute of her entire existence fractured. Kaelin stayed close to Elias, her hand gripping the rough fabric of his jacket. The empathy that made her a brilliant diplomat now threatened to overwhelm her. She felt the collective despair of the cavernous slums pressing against her chest. Elias sensed her distress through the lingering echoes of their psychic bond. He stopped in the shadow of a massive structural pylon, pulling her into a tight, grounding embrace. He pressed his forehead against hers, forcing her to focus solely on his steady breathing and the solid reality of his presence. He quietly assured her that they would tear down Vorek's regime first, and then they would fix the broken foundation of her world together. Their intimate moment was cut short by the sweeping crimson beam of a hunter-killer drone scanning the thoroughfare below. The sleek, heavily armed machine moved with predatory silence, cross-referencing biometric data in a relentless search for the fugitives. Elias quickly shoved the women into a narrow alcove behind a cluster of active steam pipes. The intense thermal radiation masked their biological signatures just as the drone floated past, its targeting lasers dancing inches from their faces. As soon as the machine faded into the gloom, Elias declared they needed an untraceable network uplink and medical supplies. His ribs were throbbing violently from the arena encounter, and Lyra needed a console to weaponize the truth. They ventured deeper into a makeshift bazaar constructed from shipping containers and scrapped atmospheric scrubbers. Elias approached a heavily modified Aethelgardian merchant operating a black market tech stall. The vendor possessed cybernetic optical implants that glowed a sickly green. Evaluating Elias with obvious suspicion, Elias did not attempt diplomacy. He slammed the heavy barrel of his stolen pulse rifle onto the metal counter. He produced a single, flawless diamond he had pried from Kaelin's discarded ceremonial collar and demanded a quantum data slicer. 3 encrypted communication nodes, and a military-grade cellular regenerator. The vendor attempted to haggle, citing the immense risk of dealing with armed strangers during a sudden planetary lockdown. Elias offered a chilling, mirthless smile, cocked the rifle, and explained precisely how much risk the vendor would face if he declined the transaction. The negotiation concluded immediately in Elias's favor. They took refuge in an abandoned subterranean water purification plant, surrounded by silent, towering filtration tanks. Kaelin applied the cellular regenerator to Elias's bruised torso. The cold, metallic device hummed against his skin, knitting the microscopic fractures in his bones within minutes. Her touch lingered long after the medical procedure finished. her fingers tracing the rough scars from his terrestrial past. The stark danger of their situation stripped away all remaining pretense, leaving a raw, fiercely possessive devotion between them. Lyra watched them, a soft, rare smile touching her lips, before she turned her formidable intellect toward the stolen quantum data slicer. She jacked the device directly into a severed municipal fiber optic trunk line, her fingers flying across the holographic interface with blistering speed. Elias and Kalen stood guard, watching the shadows for any sign of Vorek's execution squads. Lyra systematically dismantled the High Council's primary firewalls, plunging deep into the restricted data streams of the Chancellor's personal archive. What she found was far worse than a simple political coup. She projected the decrypted files into the damp air of the purification plant. Vorek had not merely planned to annihilate Earth. He had brokered a secret, treasonous pact with the very encroaching threat the Galactic Treaty was designed to oppose. He was intentionally sabotaging the Alliance from within, trading the sovereignty of neighboring star systems for absolute dictatorial control over the core worlds. Earth was just the first intended casualty in a massive, systemic betrayal of the entire galaxy. Elias stared at the glowing holographic orders. The stakes had instantly shifted from a personal survival mission to preventing a galactic genocide. They possessed the smoking gun necessary to strip Vorek of his command and halt the dreadnought fleet. However, Lyra's expression remained terrifyingly grim. She stated that broadcasting this data from the undercity was impossible. Vorek had instituted a planet-wide communications blackout, routing all outbound signals through the central spire on the surface, to expose the Chancellor to the ascendancy and the waiting galactic ambassadors. They had to physically infiltrate the most heavily guarded structure on the planet, fight their way to the apex broadcast chamber, and upload the data manually. Elias checked the power cell on his single stolen rifle. They were 3 fugitives facing an entire planetary defense force. Yet, as he looked at the resolute, burning fury in Lyra's pale eyes and the unshakable courage radiating from Kalen, he knew they were going to climb back into the light and set the false utopia ablaze. He just had to figure out how to bypass the automated orbital defense grid protecting the spire. And what exactly Vorek meant by the cryptic, encrypted directive labeled Project Annihilation, buried at the bottom of his data stream. Infiltrating the most heavily fortified structure on a planet you are actively trying to save requires either an army of specialized mercenaries or a staggering amount of sheer, unadulterated stupidity. Elias Vance possessed neither an army nor the good sense to walk away from a suicide mission. Armed with Chancellor Vorek's decrypted treason files, Elias outlined a plan that made Lyra's flawless tactical algorithms weep. The central broadcast spire was a kilometer-high needle of woven diamond and hard light, guarded by automated orbital defense grids and legions of elite Crimson soldiers. To a logical Aethelgardian mind, a frontal assault without military backing was a mathematical impossibility resulting in certain death. To a terrestrial freight pilot who had survived Jovian blockades in cargo ships held together by duct tape and blind faith, it was just another challenging Tuesday. They abandoned the relative safety of the subterranean water purification plant and ascended through the planet's crust using a primary atmospheric intake valve, riding a massive invisible blast of hyperoxygenated air. They bypassed the heavily guarded surface elevators entirely, propelled straight into the lower maintenance levels of the towering spire. Here, the sleek pearl-white elegance of the capital gave way to brutalist architecture and massive humming cooling towers. Lyra immediately utilized the stolen quantum data slicer to spoof the internal biometric scanners. She projected the digital ghost of a high-ranking maintenance technician over their physical signatures, effectively rendering them invisible to the automated surveillance grid. They moved like phantoms through the cavernous mechanical decks, The contrast between the damp, desperate undercity they had just escaped and the sterile, imposing opulence of the broadcast center was deeply jarring. However, Aethelgardian security was designed to counter elegant, high-tech slicing, not brute-force terrestrial sabotage. When a secondary biometric gate refused to accept Lyra's spoofed code, locking them inside a sealed transit tube, Elias did not ask her to rewrite the firewall. He simply jammed the heavy barrel of his stolen pulse rifle into the exposed junction box beside the door and pulled the trigger. The resulting electrical surge cascaded through the local network, blinding the surveillance grid in their sector for exactly 4 minutes. Before the automated repair protocols could engage, Kaelin manually pried the heavy blast doors apart utilizing a repurposed hydraulic strut she had scavenged from the undercity. Her physical strength, augmented by her Aethelgardian physiology, snapped the locking mechanisms with terrifying ease. Tension radiated off Lyra as she continuously monitored the intercepted communications chatter on a handheld display. Vorek had realized they were no longer hiding in the subterranean slums. The Chancellor was furiously redeploying his hunter-killer drones and elite guard detachments back to the surface. Completely unaware the ghosts he was hunting were already inside his most secure fortress. They reached the upper echelons of the spire, approaching the threshold of the central broadcast nexus. It was a massive circular chamber suspended above the clouds, dominated by a towering crystalline mainframe that managed the communication traffic for the entire system. But Vorek's paranoia had anticipated every variable. He had stationed a heavy contingent of his personal Crimson Guard directly in their path. A patrol of 6 heavily armored soldiers rounded the corner of the polished hallway, their visors instantly locking onto the intruders. There was no time for stealth, and absolutely no room for a tactical retreat. Elias shoved Lyra and Kaelin hard toward the heavy glass doors of the Nexus. He ordered them to decrypt the main broadcast array and upload the files, promising he would buy them the exact amount of time they needed. He did not wait for an argument or a tearful goodbye. Elias stepped directly into the center of the narrow corridor, raising his pulse rifle and transforming himself into a stubborn human barricade. The confined space turned the resulting firefight into a brutal, close-quarters nightmare. Elias knew he could not trade direct shots with heavily armored Aethelgardian elites, so he violently altered the geometry of the battlefield. He aimed his first volley not at the guards, but at the structural hard-light tethers supporting the ornate ceiling directly above them. The ceiling collapsed in a devastating shower of heavy crystal and twisted metal, pinning the 2 lead soldiers to the floor and creating a chaotic, impassable barrier of debris. Superheated plasma scorched the air, melting the pristine walls and searing a deep, agonizing burn across Elias's left shoulder. He ignored the pain, returning precise, suppressing fire through the gaps in the rubble. He fought with a desperate, feral intensity that the sterile combat algorithms of the Aethelgardian military simply could not predict or counter. When a heavily shielded guard managed to flank the debris pile, Elias did not shoot at the energy shield. He lunged forward, using his momentum to drive the heavy butt of his rifle brutally into the vulnerable, unarmored joint of the soldier's knee. The guard collapsed, and Elias used the fallen soldier as cover from the relentless barrage of plasma fire tearing down the hallway. He was fighting for his life, but more importantly, he was fighting for the 2 women currently tearing apart the digital locks behind him. Inside the Nexus chamber, Lyra and Kaelin worked in perfect, desperate synchronization. Lyra's fingers were a blur across the light-reactive console, slicing through Vorek's military-grade encryption with terrifying speed. Her analytical mind processed millions of variables a second, isolating the core command subroutines. Kaelin bypassed the physical hardware overrides, her empathetic intuition guiding her hands through the complex web of power routing. Through the profound psychic bond forged in the arena, they could feel the distinct echoes of Elias's pain and exhaustion. Every near miss, every searing burn translated as a dull ache in their own chests. It was a constant, agonizing reminder of the heavy price he was paying for every second they took. Kaelin, tears blurred her vision, but she forced her hands to remain steady, weaving raw power into the communication array. The heavy blast doors of the Nexus groaned loudly as heavily armed reinforcements arrived in the corridor outside, unleashing concentrated thermal charges against the reinforced glass. Elias was down to his last power cell. His vision was swimming from heavy smoke inhalation and significant blood loss. He braced himself against the wall, leveling his weapon at the fracturing doors, fully prepared to die defending the threshold. Just as the glass shattered outward, sending a wave of razor-sharp shrapnel across the corridor. A blinding, localized wave of golden light pulsed from the massive crystalline mainframe. The upload hit 100%. The central spire instantaneously hijacked every communication satellite, orbital station, and public holographic display screen in the entire Aethelgardian system. Chancellor Vorek's face, captured in the heavily encrypted files, loomed massive over the floating capital planet. The broadcast laid bare his entire treasonous conspiracy to billions of citizens simultaneously. The decrypted data streams displayed his forged signatures on agreements to subjugate Earth. It showcased the highly detailed, unprovoked invasion plans for neighboring star systems. Most damning of all, it broadcast his explicit recorded orders to intentionally sabotage the upcoming galactic treaty by allowing the Rim threat to annihilate the coalition fleets. Vorek's pristine, fiercely logical justification for military action was instantly exposed as a petty, genocidal grab for absolute dictatorial power. The unfiltered truth echoed across the star system, plunging the utopian society into instantaneous, paralyzing shock. Out in the ruined corridor, the Crimson Guards ceased their assault entirely, their sophisticated weapons lowered as they stared in horror at the holographic evidence of their commander's ultimate betrayal, projected directly onto the scarred walls of the spire. Elias slumped heavily against the shattered doorframe, dropping the empty pulse rifle to the deck. A bloody, cynical smile pulled at his lips as he watched the Imperial soldiers question the foundation of their entire reality. They had successfully ripped the mask off the tyrant and broadcast his sins to the stars. But Elias knew from hard experience that a cornered, humiliated predator was infinitely more dangerous than a hidden one. He stared down the smoke-filled corridor, wondering exactly what horrific failsafe Vorek would activate now that his grand empire was crumbling into dust around him, and whether he possessed enough strength left to survive the final, inevitable collision. Exposing a dictator to a galaxy of billions was the easy part. Surviving his immediate, heavily armed temper tantrum was where the math got complicated. The holographic evidence of Vorek's treason continued to loop across the skies of the capital planet, painting the violet clouds with the harsh reality of his betrayal. Inside the shattered corridor of the broadcast spire, the Crimson Guards lowered their weapons, their absolute loyalty fractured by the indisputable proof of their commander's genocidal ambitions. For exactly 10 seconds, Elias Vance allowed himself to believe they had actually won. Then the entire spire violently shuddered. Thick, impenetrable blast doors forged from pure titanium dropped from the ceiling, sealing the Nexus chamber from the outside world. The ambient lighting shifted to an aggressive, warning red. Vorek, realizing his political empire had evaporated in an instant, had initiated a localized, ultimate lockdown protocol from his command gauntlet. A secondary maintenance hatch at the rear of the chamber blew completely open. Chancellor Vorek stepped through the smoke, clad in heavy ceremonial combat armor that hummed with a personal energy shield. He wielded a dual-phase plasma incinerator, a weapon designed to vaporize heavily armored vehicles, not unarmored diplomats. His diamond-carved features were distorted by absolute, unhinged rage. He was a man who had orchestrated the fate of star systems for decades, and he was completely unwilling to accept defeat at the hands of a terrestrial freight pilot. Vorak raised the incinerator, aiming directly at the central mainframe. He declared that if he could not rule the Ascendancy, he would plunge it into a dark age by destroying the central communications hub and detonating the spire's primary fusion core. Elias stepped out from the cover of the console, placing his battered, bleeding body squarely between the Chancellor and the two women he had sworn to protect. He had no weapon, no shield, and his left arm hung uselessly at his side. Lyra and Kaelin moved instantly to flank him, refusing to let him stand alone. The psychic bond they shared flared with a fierce, protective defiance. Lyra's hands hovered over the manual override controls of the room's environmental systems, while Kaelin subtly shifted her stance, preparing to manipulate the physical gravity plating beneath Vorak's boots if given a fraction of a second. Elias knew a physical confrontation was suicide. He needed to use the one weapon he had spent his entire life mastering, the art of the bluff. He offered Vorak a slow, bloody grin, leaning casually against the humming crystalline mainframe as if they were discussing grain tariffs in a boardroom. He informed the Chancellor that destroying the spire was entirely pointless. The data packet Lyra uploaded was not merely broadcast to the local Aethelgardian satellites. Elias lied with absolute, staggering conviction. He claimed they had routed the transmission through the quantum slipstream drive of his salvaged freighter directly to the United Earth Directorate's military high command. Vorak paused, his finger tightening on the trigger, his analytical mind attempting to calculate the variables of this impossible assertion. Elias capitalized on the hesitation. He leaned heavily into Vorak's own deep-seated prejudice. He reminded the Chancellor of his speech at the banquet, how he had correctly labeled humanity a violent, deeply irrational species capable of horrific destruction. Elias confirmed every single one of Vorak's worst fears. He painted a vivid, terrifying picture of what would happen if the UED received proof that an alien dictator was plotting to glass their homeworld. He stated that humanity did not fight with elegant plasma arrays or polite, automated drones. They fought with dirty, world-cracking kinetic bombardments and thermonuclear spite. He assured Vorak that if the fusion core of the spire detonated, taking the lives of the High Envoys and Earth's sole representative, the human military would not ask for a treaty. They would tear a hole in the slipstream, descend upon the floating capital, and turn the pristine bioluminescent utopia into a radioactive crater just to send a message. The Chancellor's arrogance wavered. The utter certainty in Elias's voice, backed by the terrifying historical data Vorak himself had reviewed, created a catastrophic failure in the Aethelgardians' tactical logic. For a society that had eradicated war millennia ago, the concept of mutually assured, messy destruction was completely paralyzing. In that crucial second of hesitation, Elias gave Kaelin a sharp nod. She slammed her hands down on the console, completely reversing the localized gravity plating directly beneath Vorak's heavily armored boots. The Chancellor was violently launched toward the ceiling. Simultaneously, Lyra triggered the emergency atmospheric venting system. A blast of hyper-chilled, dense coolant gas erupted from the floor grates, blinding Vorak and instantly freezing the thermal regulators on his plasma incinerator. The weapon cracked under the extreme temperature shift, rendering it useless. Vorak hit the ceiling hard, the impact shattering his personal energy shield, before Kaelin restored the gravity, sending him crashing brutally back to the polished floor. Before the Chancellor could recover, the heavy titanium blast doors of the Nexus chamber were forced open from the outside. A massive contingent of the High Council's loyalist guard, clad in their pristine pearl-white armor, flooded into the room. They surrounded the fallen Chancellor, leveling their pulse rifles at his chest. Vorak looked up, blood trickling from his pristine features, and finally realized that his grand, logical design had been entirely dismantled by the chaotic, unpredictable nature of a species he had deemed inferior. He was hauled roughly to his feet and dragged from the chamber in absolute silence. The immediate existential threat to the galaxy ending not with a massive space battle, but with a well-timed lie and a broken coolant pipe. The adrenaline keeping Elias on his feet suddenly evaporated. The edges of his vision darkened, and he staggered. Lyra and Kalen were there instantly, catching him before he hit the deck. They lowered him gently to the floor, Kalen's hands frantically searching for the remaining medical supplies in her pouches, while Lyra held his face, her cool, pale eyes shining with an overwhelming mixture of relief and profound affection. An hour later, the Nexus chamber was secured and a makeshift medical bay had been established. Elias sat on a diagnostic bed, his wounds treated with advanced cellular knitters that felt like thousands of tiny, warm needles beneath his skin. The heavy doors parted respectfully, and the senior members of the High Council entered the room. These were the architects of Aethelgardian society, beings of immense intellect and rigid tradition. They approached Elias, looking at his singed tunic, his bruised face, and the two high envoys standing fiercely protective at his sides. The lead counselor, an elder woman with eyes like polished silver, did not offer political platitudes. She bowed her head in a gesture of absolute, unprecedented respect. She formally apologized to Elias Vance. She acknowledged that their pursuit of absolute perfection had blinded them to the insidious rot growing within their own leadership. She stated that the ascendancy owed its continued existence to the very human traits they had so arrogantly dismissed: stubbornness, lateral thinking, and an irrational willingness to sacrifice oneself for others. Elias accepted the apology with a tired, genuine smile. He told them to save the formal speeches for the upcoming Galactic Summit, because they had a lot of rebuilding to do before the Rim threat arrived. The High Council retreated, leaving the trio alone in the quiet aftermath of the revolution. The capital planet outside the reinforced glass was no longer a gilded cage, but a society waking up to a harsh, necessary truth. The political assassination was foiled, the tyrant was in chains, and the immediate crisis was resolved. Yet, as Elias looked at Lyra and Kalen, feeling the unyielding strength of the bond that tethered their minds and hearts together, he knew the greatest challenge was still ahead. He wondered how exactly a cynical freight pilot was supposed to navigate a formal, intergalactic wedding ceremony, and what bizarre, ancient traditions the Ascendancy had planned for the actual culmination of their union. Saving the galaxy from a pristine, tyrannical dictator turned out to be surprisingly straightforward compared to the logistical nightmare of planning an interstellar wedding. The formal ceremony of union took place 3 standard weeks after Chancellor Vorek's spectacular fall from grace, and the capital city of Aethelgard had transformed. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of forced perfection had evaporated, replaced by a vibrant, slightly chaotic energy that the floating utopia had not experienced in millennia. The High Council, thoroughly humbled by their brush with annihilation, had granted Elias Vance complete creative control over the final rites. Elias, utilizing his formidable negotiation skills, immediately discarded the ancient, life-threatening endurance trials in favor of something vastly more dangerous: a traditional Earth reception. The grand sanctum of the High Council was unrecognizable. The sterile, hard-light architecture was draped in millions of cascading, bioluminescent blooms harvested from the planet's surface. Long, crystalline tables hovered above the floor, loaded not with synthetic protein cubes, but with a staggering fusion of Aethelgardian nectars and heavily spiced terrestrial delicacies. At the center of the dais stood Elias. He had flatly refused the silver diplomatic tunic, opting instead for a classic, impeccably tailored charcoal suit flown in directly from Earth. He looked sharp, entirely out of place among the flowing silks of the alien aristocracy, and completely in his element. Beside him stood high envoys Lyra and Kaelin. They wore garments that defied human description, spun from a material that shifted color like capturing a nebula in silk. Lyra's dress was a deep, commanding midnight blue that accented her silver hair and pale, striking eyes, while Kaelin radiated in a warm, shimmering violet that perfectly matched her vibrant, empathetic spirit. They did not stand rigidly apart, bound by strict caste protocols. They stood close to Elias, their hands resting comfortably in his. The psychic bond forged in the subterranean arena had settled from a raging torrent into a warm, constant hum at the back of their minds. Elias could feel Lyra's quiet, steadfast pride, and Kaelin's overwhelming radiant joy without a single word being spoken. The union was sealed not with blood or survival, but with a simple, profoundly human gesture. Elias slipped two plain, unadorned bands of terrestrial gold onto their fingers. The Aethelgardian elites watched in hushed fascination as the formidable envoys accepted this ancient, primitive metal, an anchor tying their magnificent floating world to the dirt and grit of Earth. The ceremony smoothly transitioned into the signing of the Great Galactic Treaty. The heavy doors of the sanctum parted, and the United Earth Directorate delegation entered. The human generals and politicians looked utterly bewildered, their rigid military dress uniforms clashing wildly with the ethereal beauty of the alien court. They had arrived on massive, clunky dropships that practically belched exhaust onto the pristine landing pads, a stark reminder of humanity's chaotic, mechanical nature. Yet, when the Earth ambassador approached the floating crystalline table, the elder counselor of Aethelgard did not look down on him. She offered a bow of genuine respect. The treaty was signed. Earth was officially welcomed into the galactic community, not as a volatile vassal state to be controlled, but as a vital, highly respected ally. The dark, looming specter of a forced annexation was completely erased. The massive dreadnought fleets orbiting the core worlds powered down their weapons, turning their sensors outward toward the deep dark of the galactic rim. The unnamed, encroaching threat was still out there, gathering its terrible strength in the shadows. But it would no longer face a divided, arrogant galaxy. It would face the technological supremacy of the Aethelgardian ascendancy, guided and fortified by the messy, brilliant, fiercely stubborn tactical minds of Earth. As the grand reception reached a crescendo of alien music and clinking glasses, Elias subtly guided Lyra and Kaelin away from the throngs of politicians. They slipped through a series of quiet corridors, emerging onto a private, sweeping balcony that overlooked the dazzling expanse of the capital. The violet clouds drifted lazily past the woven diamond spires. The city below was a sprawling ocean of soft, pulsing light, peaceful and secure. Elias leaned against the smooth railing, loosening his tie with a deep, contented sigh. Kaelin stepped under his arm, resting her head against his shoulder. She looked down at the gold band on her finger, her dark eyes reflecting the starlight. She whispered that human traditions were remarkably efficient, noting that a small circle of metal carried infinitely more weight than a monolithic stone spire. Lyra joined them on his other side, her posture entirely relaxed, the heavy mantle of leadership temporarily set aside. She looked at Elias, a rare, playful smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. She informed him that her first act as a fully bonded partner was to review his terrestrial financial records. She had found the massive, outstanding debts he owed to the Jovian mining cartels. Elias winced, preparing for a lecture on fiscal responsibility. Instead, Lyra smoothly explained that she had not paid off the debt. She had simply purchased the entire cartel outright, using the loose change from her diplomatic discretionary fund. She mentioned casually that the cartel bosses were currently undergoing mandatory, highly rigorous retraining in Aethelgardian corporate ethics, a process she suspected they would find incredibly unpleasant. Elias threw his head back and laughed, the sound echoing freely into the night sky, a chaotic, joyous noise that the perfect city was finally learning to embrace. He looked between the two incredible women who had completely rewritten the trajectory of his life. He thought back to that cramped, freezing cockpit on the edge of the solar system, dodging repo ships and eating protein paste. He had been a cynical, broken man who answered a bizarre space-classified ad on a whim, driven by nothing more than a desperate need for a change of scenery. He had expected a trap, or perhaps a quick, merciful death. He had not expected to find the missing pieces of his own soul wrapped in alien silk and terrifying intellect. Elias pulled them both closer, staring out at the infinite expanse of the stars. The universe was vast, cold, and entirely unpredictable. But standing there, anchored by the unshakable strength of Lyra's mind and the profound, fiery warmth of Kaelin's heart, the darkness did not seem so vast anymore. It was a profound realization. The Aethelgardians had spent millennia trying to engineer all the flaws out of existence, believing that perfection was the ultimate shield. But perfection was brittle. It shattered under the weight of true, raw malice. It was the flaws, the messy, chaotic, deeply imperfect nature of humanity that provided the flexibility to survive. Our differences were not a disease to be cured or a weakness to be hidden. When bound by genuine empathy, shared sacrifice, and an absolutely irrational willingness to fight for one another, those differences became an impenetrable armor. They were a union of logic and chaos, of serene starlight and terrestrial fire, and whatever ancient terrible horrors were waiting for them out on the jagged edge of the galactic rim. Elias Vance knew exactly one thing for certain. They were going to give the universe one hell of a fight. Thank you so much for watching this journey into the unknown. If you enjoyed this blend of sci-fi adventure, political intrigue, and unexpected romance, please take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves a great story. Drop a comment down below with the word resonance, so I know you made it all the way to the end of the journey. And please, hit that hype button so the algorithm shares this video with more viewers exactly like you. Your support keeps these stories coming. Stay curious, stay stubborn, and I will see you in the next one.